Today we'll be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Utah. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows total filings by year in Utah since 1990. During that time, there have been about 350,000 cases filed in the state. In the early 1990s, filings were running around 7,500 per year. This increased throughout the 1990s, and by 2000, filings were up to 15,000. And then they spiked again in the early 2000s, getting up to over 20,000 for 4 years. One thing that's kind of unusual with Utah is that there wasn't much of a surge in filings in 2005. Most states, if they'd had a pattern like this, their 2005 figure would have been up somewhere around here. And Utah didn't have as big a spike prior to bankruptcy reform as other states. But there was a huge drop-off in 2006, and followed by another big run-up of filings where they got back up to about where they'd been, say, in 2001. And more than double what they've been in the early 1990s, and then since then are down about 1/3. So right now filings are about where they were in 1997, well below where they were just prior to bankruptcy reform, but well above where they were back in early 1990s, where most states are about the same as where they were back then. Now, this map shows filings relative to population over the period 1990 to 2015. And the states colored red have the highest bankruptcy rates, more than 25% above average. Utah's in this category. There have been 35% above average overall over a 26-year period. And that ranks them sixth in the country. Tennessee is the perennial leader almost every year, but Georgia, Nevada, Alabama, and Indiana are also all a little bit above Utah. Although this is based on population, where if we had run it based on households, probably Utah would have been up in second or third place, because Utah has much larger households, an average size household, than the rest of the country. The typical household size in Utah is 3.1, and nearly every state is in a fairly narrow range from 2.4 to 2.7. So I think that's shows the influence of the LDS Church, but whatever the case, the bankruptcy rate in Utah is extremely high, and even higher than this map might indicate. Now, we look at it year by year. You can see Utah is the blue, and the red is the national average. In the early 1990s, Utah was pretty close to the average. It really spiked from 2000 to 2004 when they were more than 60% above average. And then after bankruptcy reform, they fell right back down to about the national average. But then in recent years, they've been 40–50% above average since, say, 2010 to 2015. They've been well above average. So the bankruptcy rate is very volatile in Utah, more so than most places, and so they go from periods of about average filings to well above average. This chart shows Chapter 7 filings in the state. You can see that in the early 1990s, running right around 5,000 per year, and then from 1995 to about 2002, they tripled, got up to about 15,000. A very small spike in 2005, and most states starting here in 2004 would have been up about here in 2005. So there wasn't as big a frenzy of filing in Utah as other states just prior to bankruptcy reform. And October of 2005. But then there was a big, 80% drop off the next year. Filings really rebounded quite highly and got up to over 12,000 by 2010. Still below where they had been prior to bankruptcy reform, but double where they were in the early 1990s, and have dropped off about 40% since then. Right in 2015, filings were about where they were, say, in 1997, about half of where they were prior to bankruptcy reform, but well above 1990. And the typical state is right at about 1990 levels right now. One thing that's unusual about Utah is that the Chapter 7 cases are very likely to be closed as asset cases there. It's a very high rate. Nationwide, 6 to 8% of Chapter 7 cases end up with some money being collected and distributed by the trustees. In Utah, it's been closer to 20%, and fourth highest, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming are the three highest. Arizona is also very high. But you can see, in contrast, for example, in less than 2% of cases in California end up as asset cases. And also the average range, the 5 to 10% range, would include the national average, but there are very few states that are average. They tend to be either very high or very low, and Utah certainly a lot of asset cases out there relative to most other states. Looking at Chapter 11 cases filed per year, there's a drop-off through most of the 1990s, and that's happened pretty much everywhere. Now we tend to see, filings tend to be below 50 most years, although higher during and after recessions. But basically, there's not a whole lot of Chapter 11 activity in Utah in recent years, and it looks like 2016 there'll only be about 30 or so filed in the state. Chapter 13 filings in the state were fairly low in 1990, really jumped up through the 1990s, but there are a number of western states that had a real peak from 96 to 1998, and where with Utah's it was more about 2002 where they peaked. But there's a big run-up in filings and then a huge drop-off, particularly after bankruptcy reform, then back up to near-peak levels during the Great Recession, and then have been down by about a quarter or so since then. So right now, Chapter 13 filings of state are below where they were from 1997 to 2004, but double where they were in the early 1990s, and most states are about a third higher than they were in 1990. So, but an unusual pattern of ups and downs in Utah over this time. And looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13, the red line is the national average, and it's kind of hugged around 30% for several decades, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. In Utah, started out a little below average in the early 90s, went well above it and over 40% from the late 1990s, and then has dropped down a little bit and peaked back up again and still up, and so it's above average now. And about 40% of the cases in the state are Chapter 13, and there's not too many states outside of the southeastern portion of the country that have that high a Chapter 13 rate. This chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in the state as kind of a proxy of how the economy has gone. The blue line is Utah, and the red is the national average. And you can see that Utah has been consistently has a lower than average unemployment rate, and although it went up quite a bit during the recession, it peaked around 8% compared to nearly 10% nationwide, and both the national and the Utah rate have come down. So national is a little under 5% now, and Utah is around a little under 4%, actually. Now, nationwide filings peaked back in September 2000, the year ended September of 2010, and since then they're down by nearly one half. The biggest declines have been in the Northeast, most of the Northeast, and in the Southwest, and particularly Nevada and California have dropped by at least 70% since the peak. The smallest declines have been generally throughout the Southeast, places that have a lot of Chapter 13 cases, but also Utah, and it's kind of an exception in that part of the country in that it's by far the smallest decline of any of the western states since this most recent peak. Looking at this quarter by quarter to see what's happened, the national average, the declines have been running 10 to 15% from 2011 to 2015, and then the rate of decline has been slowing in the last year and a half or so. In Utah, you can see that filings were still going up for about a year after they were going down nationwide, and then from 2011 to to the present, the declines have been pretty close to what's happened nationwide, but generally in the 10% range. But the rate seems to be slowing down right now. But sometimes sometimes you get kind of an unclear pattern. In the first half of this year, filings were down 5.9% nationwide compared to 5.3% in Utah. Third quarter looks like another 5% decline. On this map, you see the states that are colored red are places where filings are actually going up in 2016. And if we looked at this back in 2 years ago, say, there wouldn't have been any states colored red. In fact, most of them would have been colored white, which is the declines over 10%. Now there's only a handful of states that are showing major declines, and I'm thinking that most states will start to show increases by in 2017 and 2018. And I put Utah into that category. Overall, I see about 11,500 cases filed in the state in 2016. Modest increases in the coming years. I don't see any return to the 20,000 or more cases filed per year from 2002 to 2005 without major bankruptcy legislation or another severe recession. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Utah. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.